thanks a lot for the kind words of introduction. My remit for today's panel was, on the one hand, to give an introduction to legal ontologies for the non-technologists among you. So my understanding is that some of you in the audience are new to technology, have an interest, but not that much experience maybe. And also talking a little bit about a few examples just to show to you what power they might bring to our job. We have done an excellent panel of four other speakers who will also introduce some of the experiences they made. As so often, when I have to speak after Giovanni, I've been massively trying to rearrange my slides for the last hour or so, because so many of the things I had originally planned to say, he said much, much better than I could possibly do. But at least in the first part, I want to step back maybe and really give a type of introduction to ontologies for dummies, a very, very short one, and then moving on to some of the things that are exciting for me about that specific approach to legal reasoning. So, what are ontologies? With apologies for this German cultural reference, what are ontologies? Well, let's pretend we are totally stupid and really start at the beginning. Ontologies are the answer to the question, what on earth are you talking about? Because whenever we talk about something, if we have a theory, if we have a communication, a conversation, we have a domain about which we talk, about which we try to reach understanding. And that process very often is a negotiation. So when I talk about music and you talk about music, you might have slightly different things in mind. But as our discussion progresses, our conceptual understandings possibly align. And we might then be able to agree on borderline cases much more than we were before that. So ontologies essentially are the thing we are talking about, the things that our discourses, our theories presuppose to exist, and which then enable us to do communication. Now that sounds relatively straightforward. And if we go back to the example from the Feuerzangenbowle, here you get a ontology of a steam engine. A steam engine is a big black room which has two little holes in it. Through one, steam gets in, through the other, steam goes out. That's how the professor or the teacher of physics tried to explain what a steam engine really is. And once we start to take this apart, we realize just how complex the world is about which we talk. And we might think initially of steam engine just as a physical object. But this physical object has rather interesting and intriguing constitutive parts. It has two holes. Without the holes, the steam engine wouldn't work. But what type of thing is a hole? A hole is something that exists in virtue of not being there, of an absence. So how can we make conceptual sense of that? How can we describe what a hole is, for instance, to a computer? It is a room, a dark room. But what is a room? What makes a room into a room? What are the conceptual properties that a room has? It's not a physical thing. It's a function. It's a structure. It's a constraint. It might be lots of different things, but none of them are really straightforward. And the amazing thing is, as humans, we operate these rather complex conceptual environments without even hesitating about it. It comes very, very natural to us in a way it might not do to computers. So philosophers from a very early stage onwards realized that this was really one of the key questions of philosophical endeavor. And it really starts with Aristotle. The modern theory of ontologies owes him a lot. He was the first who thought, well, if we want to gain knowledge about the world, we have to structure it. We have to superimpose a structure where everything, every concrete instance that we study finds its place. So we have to come up with something that allows us to whatever object we are given to say it is of that specific kind. Holes are one kind of object, steam engine are another one, rooms are another one yet. And he came up with a way of structuring the entire field of knowledge that, at least on the top level, used a couple of very abstract, very general ways of classification. Things exist, that's being. And we might ask, and I will ask later on, if there are also things that do not exist. They have a being, a substance, and then they have different properties. Some of these properties are like being read. They are accidents that adhere to the individual on its own. And there are relations, being taller than, being a friend of. And working downwards that scheme, he thought he had found a way of answering for any specific object given to him the question, where does it belong in that scheme? That idea was later on developed further by Peter of Spain. The tree of porphyry became very important here. Here you can see how it works for an individual. We can ask of Socrates, who are you? What are you? And he is a human. On virtue of being human, he is also rational. Or rather a rational animal. He is also an animal, but a specific animal, one that is rational. He is a specific type of living thing, one that is sensitive. He's a specific type of body, one that is animate, and so on and so forth. So here we can already see also the relation between ontology and logic. On the one hand, we classify our world, and once we have done the classification, we can use a logic to gain new knowledge about it, to reason about the world. It has become popular to reconstruct Aristotle or Peter of Spain through the type of classical logic you are more or less familiar with. Historically, that's not quite correct. He used a logic of concepts, both Aristotle and Peter. But for our purposes, for computer purposes, it's good enough to say, well, we can combine these classification schemes with inference engines, which then allow us to reason about the world. Once we know that Socrates is a human, we know also lots of other things about him. For instance, that he is an animal living, a body, and has a substance. This thing really took off with early modernity and the breakthrough of modern science. And one of the most iconic examples probably is the Linnean taxonomy, the attempt to really put every living biological thing into a logical order. Not just ordering them by similarity, even though that was an important ordering principle, but to impose other structures on that specific domain. Good news, and that's what you heard from Giovanni, and I will go through this very, very quickly because it really repeats it. You as lawyers have been doing this at least as long as Aristotle. And we all think in a way like ontology engineers. So, for instance, Gaius and institutions told us that law is a matter of persons, things, and actions, and nothing else. So we can subdivide the entire field of law, our object matter, what is law about, what is the stuff of law, into these three broad categories: persons, things, and actions. And that was so influential that it did not only impact on the civil law tradition, even though I think there the influence was more direct, but we also find it in the common law tradition. This is from Blackburn's very influential legal dictionary. He simply further subdivides the domain of things, for instance, into fixed, real, or immovable, things personal or movable, and finally things mixed. So subdividing again a category, creating a conceptual network here. And obviously, if you're a German lawyer or an Italian lawyer or a French lawyer, and you're used to handle the codification of your country, you have essentially mastered an ontology. You have understood an ordering scheme that is imposed into the internal logic of the categories, and you have learned to reason with it. And Giovanni, as I said, covered that better than I could. So I'm just pointing out that at the same time as Linné tried to classify the biological world, lawyers, especially in the civil law tradition, did the same for the legal world in the codification movements. Now let's just go back to Linnaeus just for a second. Question to the panel. You are allowed to answer. Is this a fish? Who thinks this is a fish? I see this right? Nobody thinks this is a fish? Well, in a folksonomy, the way children think about it, the way early cultures think about it, if you think of the Genesis account, they might well be, because we intuitively divide living things in things that are on land, things that are animals that are in the air, like birds, and animals that are in water. They are fish, and that's where the whale belongs. And in German, at least, this is also reflected in its name, Walfisch. whale, fish. A very intuitive folksonomy that we find across a wide range of different cultures. Is it wrong in any specific way? Well, look at this one. Another ontology, one from Catholic dietary law. What type of animal are you allowed to eat on Friday? Most animals are unsuitable for Friday. Cows, rabbits, horses, they are all totally unsuitable. Friday, it's fish. But what are fish? According to Catholic dietary law, definitely trout, the one in the middle, but also whale. There's a specific edict that declares whale to be acceptable for Friday, and maybe more surprisingly, beavers. Beavers are fish for the purpose of Catholic dietary law, and there's a rather interesting legal analysis why this is the case. And this is not a mistake about their biological nature. They are simply for the purpose of the law classified for good reasons with these other animals. If you want details, I'm quite happy to supply them. The theological debate on that raged on for quite some time, but was eventually settled in favor of including beaver in the fish family. Then we get Linnean's system. And obviously, and that's what made you probably hesitate, you've all learned that's the right way to think about it. Of course, whales are not fish, they are mammals. They belong into a different group. They are the type of different entity. I'm afraid I have to disappoint you a little bit if you believe that that is the true ontology of the world. These days, we do cladism in evolutionary biology. And once you are in a clade, you are always in a clade. And therefore, according to modern biology, whales are fish. Because if they were not fish, then also real fish wouldn't be fish. That is essentially what that thing tries to show to us. So cladistically speaking, whales are fish, because the last common ancestor between what we think of fish and whales was a fish. And similarly are we. All mammals are fish, cladistically speaking. So you and I are fish, in addition to being apes, monkeys, and so on and so forth. Humans are fish, and birds are dinosaurs, cladistically speaking. That is rather worrying if you think about this beautiful dinosaur feeding fish, our relatives, to its chicks. It's not the way how we intuitively think about the world. It's rather further away from the Linnean scheme, but it is a different way to structure the world. And it also helps us to understand the difference between a taxonomy and an ontology. Ontologies are a specific type of taxonomy. Ontologies are taxonomies where the relation between concepts has a precise logical structure. So Linneo simply classified things by similarity. Cladistically speaking, we classify things by inheritance and ancestry relation, being a descendant of. And that relation has specific formal properties, which we can introduce into our world in addition to the relation between concepts. Now, why does all that matter in law? It matters in law because I would say none of these ontologies has privilege over the other. They are all different but equally valid ways to structure the world. And as lawyers, we very often have to interact with these different ways of structuring the world. We have the structure of law, but we also have the structure of the domain of regulation. And we try to align them. One of the important tasks of every lawyer is to understand how a client or a suspect or an industrial process understands and structures the world and see how the ontology of the law matches to this. And I very quickly want to give you a few examples of practical applications we've been involved with that exemplify this and also, I think, answer some of the questions that were raised with Giovanni. One was Braro. Braro was an attempt to build an ontology to tackle financial fraud in Europe. And the problem that we are having here is that the way an economist or a business science person thinks about fraud is not necessarily exactly the same way as a lawyer thinks about them. And lawyers in different countries, again, classify fraud in different ways, even when they are governed by the same overarching directive. So we have lots and lots of different ontologies, different ways to structure the world, different ways to think about them. And if we want to have a successful cross-border prosecution, we have to find ways to align them. We find a way in which the English lawyer can explain to the German lawyer that no, we don't really have a notary in England. Well, we have something we call notary, but they are not really notaries. Therefore, a certain requirement that you have is simply not applicable here. We have to decide if a Staatsanwalt is a judge or something else, a juge d'instruction, a public prosecutor. They all share certain properties, but are not strictly speaking identical. So what we tried to do in Praro was to start from the bottom to understand how in the real world typically a fraud happens, what characteristics it has, and then match it up successively to these white notes here. The black notes are facts about the world. The white notes are legal classifications to see how the different ontologies of these different countries can be made to cooperate. The legal theoretical or comparative legal theory behind that is, roughly speaking, Zweigert and Kurt's functionalism. Different legal systems are comparable because despite their conceptual differences, they share a joint physical reality. And that was a way of structuring that process of communication so that a computer can support it. So that the computer helps the English investigator, the English prosecutor, to ask the right question of their German counterpart, even though the different ways of thinking misalign, and in that way reduce the number of friction, loss of time, problems of coordinating a cross-border investigation. So that is one of the ways I think the ontologies are tremendously helpful. Unlike rules, they are not tied directly to an individual language or an individual system. They are one level of abstraction higher, and they might allow us then to see similarities and dissimilarities, to see where they overlap, and with that automate also the communication process. Orlando Conetta, student of mine now at Vincent Mason, he developed the LKIF-based transaction framework. We will hear about LKIF, I think, a bit later from Monica. Essentially, what that tried to describe was how in the context of a law firm, a specific new object is created, a Eurobond, and that Eurobond is created through the communication back and forth between a client and the lawyer, or rather a team of lawyers. Of course, the lawyers do not necessarily stay the same over the process of creating one of these bonds. What the system does is to extract from the worldview of the client and the worldview of the law firm a shared ontology that allows them to optimize that back and forth, to always know where they are in that process and to check at which point they have reached sufficient understanding that they can then action on it and go ahead. It was really successful. It was one of the reasons I think he was immediately bought out by Vincent Mason, where he is now chief knowledge engineer. Again, we have here a communication between different parties. They structure the world in slightly different ways, and the ontology helps them to keep on track in the process of creating a shared understanding. Finally, what we do at the moment in creative informatics, large research project at Edinburgh University, takes essentially the same approach on the practical side. It's where digital humanities meet IP law. Of course, one particularly interesting type of objects are artifacts, things that we create, things that do not exist in nature, but only exist there due to our ingenuity. And DLIC, company in England, they try, for instance, to automatically manage collaborative rights for musicians. There's lots of musicians that collaborate in an artistic endeavor, reuse parts of their tunes, reuse parts of their music. They create something together. And now you want to understand from a licensing perspective, from an IP perspective, what is that object? Where does it fit into our world as lawyers? And for that, we have to answer questions like, what is a work of music? What is the performance of a work of music? A recording of the performance of a work of music? A novel, a character in a novel, a storyline about a character in a novel, or a film based on the storyline of a character in a novel. All very complex objects that we create. And depending on how we create them, that has then legal consequences for their IP status. And so finally, that is my ongoing research at the moment in that context. What are these things? What are unicorns, apart from apparently being the business model of post-Brexit written, we are going to sell them a lot to the world. That seems to be the plan of our government, at least at the moment. These types of things, inventions, fictional objects, Star Trek, but also, things that are based on historical characters. Under which conditions can we say that two objects that do not exist are really the same? Famous IP litigation between Harry Potter and Tanya Grotter, who share quite a lot of characteristics, but may or may not be the same. So again, what we find here is if the law wants to serve its population, we need to have a way to realign or align systematically the way we structure the world with the way lay people, our clients, structure the world. And one of the interesting things of ontology-based legal AI is to make that explicit, to help us to see where the conceptual structure of our world and that of our clients, the communities we serve, match and where they disagree, and finding more effective ways to bring them into an overlap. So that was me, 3 short examples, hopefully, of practical applications, together with a short introduction that hopefully allows you to situate the question of ontologies in an appropriate way. They are particularly suitable, I think, whenever different conceptualization of reality need to be brought together and to be brought in alignment. That's been me.